I spent months fixing up my shed after the flood. A week later, my neighbor ran a new fence straight through it. The old boundary was wrong, he said. I didn't yell. I took out the original blueprints my uncle hid in the attic, and I knocked on his door. I spent 4 months rebuilding that shed. After the flood came through last fall, I thought it was done for. The water line hit just under the windows. The walls were soft, the roof sagged, and the floor cracked when I stepped inside. I remember standing in the doorway with a hammer in my hand, thinking, either I fix it or I let it rot. I couldn't let it rot. It wasn't just a shed, it used to be my uncle's workshop. He built it with his own hands back in the 70s. The beams were solid oak, the kind you don't see anymore. He stored everything in there, tools, fishing gear, even a little transistor radio that still worked when I found it. After he passed, it became mine, and even though I hadn't used it much before the flood, it felt like one of the last pieces of him I had left. So I fixed it. Nights after work, weekends, whenever I had the energy. I patched the roof, replaced the drywall, sealed everything. It took longer than I thought because I didn't want to cut corners. I did it right. By the time spring came around, it was dry, solid, and cleaner than it had ever been. I even restained the door and painted the trim blue, my uncle's favorite color. Then, exactly 1 week after I finished, my neighbor Todd had a new fence installed. Not in his yard. Through mine. I came outside that morning to the sound of post-hole diggers and guys shouting over drill noises. I thought they were fixing the old wood fence that ran between our properties, the one that had been leaning for years. But no. These guys were measuring a new line. It ran several feet into my yard. By noon, there were posts in the ground that cut directly through the back corner of my shed. I walked over and said, "Hey, what's going on?" Todd didn't even turn off his phone. He just said, "I had a new survey done. The old boundary line was wrong." I said, "That's my shed. It's always been there." He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Then I guess you built it on my property." Just like that. I stood there for a second trying to find words. I didn't yell. I didn't push. I just said, "I'm going to double-check that." He shrugged. "Do what you want." I went back inside and started digging. My uncle had kept everything, old tax records, newspaper clippings, even gas station receipts from the 80s. I knew if anyone had proof, it would be him. I climbed into the attic and started opening boxes. And there it was. An envelope marked House Lot 73. Inside were the original blueprints from when he built the place. Hand-drawn boundary lines. It showed clearly. The shed sat fully on our property, with a few feet to spare. I felt this heat rise in my chest. Not anger, not yet. Just disbelief. Like I'd been slapped out of nowhere. I made copies and went straight to Todd's door. He opened it a crack. I handed him the folder and said, "The fence is wrong. You're cutting into my land. These are the original blueprints." He looked at them for less than 5 seconds and said, "I've got a certified survey from last month. Not my problem. You ran a fence through my building. Then move the building." He shut the door. I stood there for a long time, holding the copy he gave back like it was trash. I didn't go to sleep that night. I stayed up reading local property laws, zoning info, easements, anything I could find. Then I called the county office the next morning and made an appointment. What I found out next made everything worse. I got a meeting with the county records office 2 days later. I brought the blueprints, photos of the shed, even old family pictures that showed it standing in the same spot, decades before Todd ever moved in. The guy at the desk was polite but tired-looking. He flipped through my papers while sipping coffee from a thermos that said "World's Okayest Dad." After a few minutes, he said, "These look legit. But the survey on file now, it's different. Yours shows the property line ending about 5 feet past the shed. The new one? It cuts 4 feet into your lot. I asked, how does that happen? He gave a half shrug. Could be a bad survey. Could be someone trying to shift things for a permit. We see it sometimes. I asked what I could do. He said, you'll need to get a licensed surveyor to verify your documents, then file a boundary dispute. Could take months. Maybe longer. I asked, can I at least stop him from finishing the fence? He sighed. Not unless you have a court order. So basically, Todd could do whatever he wanted until I jumped through all the legal hoops. I didn't have the money for a lawyer. I didn't even have money for a full survey right then. When I got home, the fence was already finished, clean, vertical panels all along the back of the yard. It looked like a prison wall. One of the posts was drilled straight into the side of my shed like it belonged there. For the next few weeks, I didn't say anything to him. I just kept quiet. I mowed my lawn. Watered the garden. Pretended everything was fine. But at night, I went back to the attic and dug through more boxes. That's when I found the letter. It was from my uncle to the original owner of Todd's house, written in 1991. A typed note with his signature at the bottom. It was about a favor. The previous neighbor had asked to run part of his fence a little inward on his land because a tree had blocked the path. My uncle had agreed, but he wrote clearly. This does not represent a permanent change to the legal boundary. It was gold. I made another copy and slipped it into Todd's mailbox with a note, you might want to read this before making permanent changes. He never responded. But the next weekend, I caught him outside, pulling weeds by the driveway. I said, you read the letter? He stood up. Yeah. Still doesn't change anything. That was with the old neighbor. Doesn't apply to me. I stared at him. You know this fence is wrong. You're choosing to pretend it's not. He smirked. I'm choosing not to care. That was the moment something in me shifted. If he wasn't going to play fair, neither was I. I didn't do anything right away. I waited. For 3 weeks, I watched him. Every evening, he'd park his truck half on the curb, half in his driveway. He left his trash cans blocking the sidewalk. He trimmed his hedges right up to the edge of the new fence, like he was proud of it. I said nothing. I nodded when we passed each other. I acted like it was over. But I started making calls. First, I contacted a local surveyor, not one of the big firms, but an old guy named Marvin who had done work in our neighborhood for years. When I told him my uncle's name, he said, oh yeah, I remember him. Real stickler for detail. Marvin agreed to come out for a small fee and take a quick look. He came by the next week. Took measurements. Used one of those tripod things and some weird digital tool. Took pictures of the shed and the fence line. When he was done, he handed me a printed note. Preliminary findings suggest the structure, shed, lies entirely within the original boundary of Lot 14, based on historic markers. He told me to file a complaint with the zoning board. I did. That's when things got weird. A week later, someone from the city left a tag on my shed, a bright orange notice that said structure under review, possible violation. It had Todd's signature at the bottom. He had filed a report claiming my shed was an unpermitted extension. He was trying to get it condemned. That night, I knocked on his door. Calm. Quiet. I asked him why he did it. He leaned on the doorframe, arms crossed. I'm protecting my property. You should do the same. I said, that shed's been here longer than you've been alive. He smiled and said, then maybe it's time it came down. I didn't speak after that. I just walked away. 2 days later, I made another call. This time to my cousin Derek. He's not a lawyer, but he works in code enforcement in the next county over. I asked him what happens if someone knowingly builds on someone else's property. He said, if you've got proof and they refuse to move it, you can sue. Especially if there's damage involved. Then he asked the important part, is there anything he built that's touching your structure? I said yes. One of his fence posts had been drilled into the outer wall of my shed. Derek said, that's a gift. That's trespassing with physical damage. File a complaint and document everything. If it goes to court, you've got leverage. So I documented everything. Photos. Video. Old blueprints. Marvin's preliminary report. My uncle's letter. Even the original pictures of the shed from the 90s with the same trim. But I didn't file the lawsuit yet. I had one more thing to do. There's a man down the street, lives in a brick house with a wraparound porch. Name's Frank. He's in his 70s, used to be a contractor, and he's lived in this neighborhood longer than anyone. I remembered something my uncle told me years ago, if you ever need to prove something around here, ask Frank. He remembers everything. So I walked down there one morning, knocked on his door, and introduced myself. He squinted at me for a second, then said, "You're Bill's nephew." I nodded. "I need to ask you something about the shed." He stepped aside and let me in like he'd been expecting me. I explained the whole thing, the fence, the survey, the letter. When I showed him the pictures and the blueprint, he didn't even flinch. "Yeah, I remember when your uncle built that thing," Frank said. "We poured the concrete in '74. I helped him lift the back wall." "Was it ever on someone else's land?" He laughed. "Hell no. We measured it 3 times. The original pins are probably still under the soil. Would you be willing to say that in a statement?" Frank gave me a long look, then said, "I'll do one better. I'll testify if it comes to that." I didn't expect that. I thanked him, then walked back up the street with my heart racing. That weekend, Todd threw a backyard party. Loud music, beer cans everywhere, people wandering into his yard and mine. I watched from the window as a drunk guy leaned on the shed wall, the same wall his fence was now bolted into, and cracked one of the side panels. That was the last straw. I took pictures of the damage and finally filed the lawsuit. Boundary encroachment. Intentional damage. Property interference. It took 3 weeks for the notice to be delivered. I watched from my porch as Todd tore it open. He looked around like he expected to see someone laughing. But there was no one. Just me, watching quietly from behind the screen door. The next day, he knocked on my door for the first time in months. He didn't look smug anymore. "You really gonna go through with this?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He held up the envelope. "You know this could get expensive." I nodded. "For both of us." He stared at me for a second, then said, "You don't have to do this." I looked at him and said, "You already did. The case is still ongoing. The shed is still standing. And every time I walk past that fence, I think about how easy it was for someone to steal something just by pretending they were right. He still lives next door. We don't talk. He doesn't make eye contact. And I haven't fixed the cracked panel yet. I leave it there, not because I can't, but because I want to remember the moment I stopped believing that being quiet would protect me.